There is a moment that football has never fully recovered from. June 22nd, 1994. The Rose Bowl in Pasadena, California, Colombia versus the United States. 93,000 people in the stands. The temperature on the pitch above 100 degrees Fahrenheit. A cross comes in from the right side. A Colombian defender stretches to cut it out. The ball deflects. It changes direction. It rolls into the net behind goalkeeper Oscar Cordoba, who can only watch. Andres Escobar, the defender, the captain, the man they called El Caballero, the gentleman, turns and looks at the ball sitting in his own goal. He closes his eyes for a moment. He puts his hands on his hips. The American players celebrate around him. He opens his eyes. He has no idea what is waiting for him at home. Millions of football fans remember Colombia's 1994 World Cup campaign as one of the sport's darkest stories. But very few know the full picture. What happened to each of the players from that squad after the tournament ended? How many are still here? How many were taken by violence, by tragedy, by the particular cruelty that seemed to follow Colombian football through those years? This is the story of Colombia 1994, the golden generation that was supposed to show the world who Colombia really was. And this is the answer to the question nobody wants to ask. Is anyone still alive? To understand what Colombia 1994 meant to the country, you first have to understand what Colombia looked like to the rest of the world in the early 1990s. It looked like Pablo Escobar, the drug lord who had terrorized the country for a decade, assassinating politicians, bombing cities, corrupting every institution he touched, shared a surname with Andres Escobar entirely by coincidence. But the coincidence mattered. The name Escobar in 1994 meant something to the rest of the world that had nothing to do with football and nothing to do with the quiet, dignified defender who wore number 2 for the national team. For many people outside Colombia, the country was defined entirely by its violence, its cartels, its body counts. The football team represented something else, an alternative image, a different story, a way of saying, this is also who we are. And the team they had was genuinely extraordinary. Carlos Valderrama. El Pibe, the kid, was the captain and the creative center of everything Colombia did with a football. He was 32 years old in 1994, an age at which most players are declining, and he played with the unhurried elegance of a man who had decided long ago that he would play football exactly as he saw fit. His hair was impossible, an enormous blonde afro that had become one of the most recognized images in South American football. His touch was exceptional. His passing range was extraordinary. He did not run fast. He did not need to. Alongside him in midfield was Freddy Rincon, a more dynamic, powerful presence, a man of enormous technical quality and physical engine, who had signed for Real Madrid after the 1990 World Cup and would later win the first FIFA Club World Championship with Corinthians. Rincon and Valderrama were the heartbeat of the team. In attack, Faustino Asprilla, a forward of electric, unpredictable brilliance, whose movement was so unusual and so difficult to read that defenders across Europe had spent years failing to contain him at Parma. And Adolfo Valencia, another forward of real quality, then playing his football at Bayern Munich. Behind them, in goal, René Higuita, the most unconventional goalkeeper on the planet. A man who regularly left his penalty area to play as a sweeper. A man who, in a friendly against England at Wembley, would deflect a shot heading goalward with a bicycle kick from his own chest. The scorpion kick. The greatest and most unnecessary piece of goalkeeping in football history, performed by a man who played the position as though its conventional rules were merely suggestions. And at the back, Andres Escobar. He was 27 years old in 1994. He played for Atlético Nacional in Medellín. He was, by the consensus of everyone who knew him, a man of unusual grace and decency in a sport and a country that could be brutal in their demands. He was called El Caballero, the gentleman, not as a nickname but as a genuine description of character. He was soft-spoken, respectful, and deeply beloved in Medellin, a city that had been through extraordinary violence in the years of Pablo Escobar's dominance and was trying to rebuild itself into something that looked like normal life. The qualifying campaign that delivered Colombia to the 1994 World Cup had been astonishing. On September 5, 1993, in Buenos Aires, Colombia defeated Argentina 5-0, 5 goals, away, against a team that was one of the favorites for the 1994 tournament. The result sent Colombia directly to the World Cup without needing a playoff. It broke Argentina's aura at home. It announced this Colombian generation to the world, Pelé. The man whose opinion on football carried more weight than almost anyone alive, predicted that Colombia would win the 1994 World Cup, not reach the final, win it. The whole country held its breath. Colombia arrived in the United States with a squad so talented and a reputation so elevated that the pressure was almost physically visible on the players during their early training sessions. Francisco Maturana, the coach, tried to keep the environment calm. He was a thoughtful, philosophical man, someone who consulted witch doctors before important matches, as Colombian football coaches occasionally did, and who believed in the spiritual preparation of his players as much as the tactical. He had managed this team through the qualifying campaign. He knew what they were capable of. He also knew that tournament football was something different from qualifying football, and that Colombia's best football had mostly been played in the relative safety of South American competition. Their first match was against Romania in Pasadena on June 18th. Romania was considered one of the stronger sides in the tournament. Gheorghe Hagi, their creative midfielder, was one of the best players in Europe. But Colombia were still heavy favorites to win the group. Romania won 3-1. It was not a close match. Colombia were outplayed, outrun, and outthought in a way that shocked the watching world and sent immediate and severe death threats to several players and to the coach. Not metaphorical threats, physical faxes, delivered to the team hotel, telling specific players they would be killed if they did not improve. But the most dramatic chapter was still ahead. The second match was against the United States. Colombia needed a victory to keep their tournament alive. The Rose Bowl was sweltering, 93,000 people, and in the 35th minute, John Harkes played a ball into the Colombian penalty area. Andrés Escobar stretched to cut it out before it reached an American attacker. The ball took a deflection off his leg and rolled past Oscar Cordoba into the net. Own goal, 1-0 to the United States. Escobar stood and looked at the goal for a moment. He looked at his teammates. He walked back into position. Colombia lost 2-1. They were effectively eliminated before their third match even began. They beat Switzerland 2-0 in a game that meant nothing for their qualification. They finished bottom of their group. They went home. What happened to the team's biggest star surprised even longtime fans who thought they understood Colombian football. Andrés Escobar was offered the chance to stay in the United States while the rest of the tournament continued. Several officials and security advisors told him it would be safer. The threats from home were real. The loss to the United States, and the own goal in particular, had provoked a fury in Colombia that those outside the country struggled to fully comprehend. He refused. "I want to go to Colombia and show my face," he told his sister, Maria Esther. He was not afraid. He was the gentleman. He had nothing to hide. He had made an error in a football match. Football players made errors. He would go home and he would face whatever came. He landed in Medellin. For several days, the reception was warmer than he had feared. People stopped him in the street not to abuse him, but to tell him it was not his fault. He seemed to relax. On the evening of July 1st, 1994, 10 days after the own goal, 12 days after his country had been eliminated, with the World Cup still ongoing and Brazil and Italy still playing, Andrés Escobar went with friends to a nightclub in Medellin called El Indio. In the early hours of July 2nd, he left the club and walked toward his car. Two men confronted him in the parking lot. There was an argument. The men were associated with the Galán brothers, drug traffickers who had allegedly bet heavily on Colombia's performance at the tournament. Andrés Escobar was shot 6 times. According to eyewitnesses, the shooter shouted, "Goal! Goal!" with each shot. He died in the parking lot of the El Indio nightclub in Medellin. He was 27 years old. The news broke across Colombia and across the football world simultaneously. The grief was extraordinary. More than 120,000 people attended his funeral in Medellin. Streets were lined. People wept openly. The country that had hoped football might give it a different story found itself instead in possession of its darkest one. The man who shot Escobar, Humberto Muñoz Castro, was sentenced to 43 years in prison and released after 11. He said he acted on orders from the Galán family. For 32 years, the Galán brothers evaded justice. No one could have predicted what came next. In April 2026, Colombian President Gustavo Petro announced that Santiago Gallón Henao, one of the men allegedly responsible for ordering Escobar's killing, had been shot dead in Mexico. 32 years after the murder, the man who had allegedly destroyed Andrés Escobar met his own end in a Mexican street decades later, still running from the consequences of a night in Medellin. Justice, when it came from a different direction and wore different clothes. Few people knew what the rest of the squad was going through after the tournament ended. For the players who survived the return to Colombia, the aftermath was complicated in ways that went far beyond the normal grief of a World Cup exit. Several received continued death threats. The coach, Francisco Maturana, lived under security protection for months. The murder of Escobar had made every player who had been on that pitch feel, to some degree, that they were being held responsible for something they could not control. Colombia did not qualify for the 1998 World Cup. They qualified for the 2002 World Cup, but were eliminated in the group stage. The decade after 1994 was, by any measure, a decline. A generation that had promised the country a championship, leaving behind a wound instead. But the most dramatic chapter was still ahead. Because the story of the 1994 squad did not end with Escobar's murder. It continued in ways that were, in several cases, as tragic. Freddy Rincon, the midfielder who had played alongside Valderrama as one of the most gifted players in South American football, survived the 1994 tournament and continued his career at the highest level. He played for Real Madrid, for Napoli, for Palmeiras and Santos, for Corinthians, where he won the first FIFA Club World Championship in 2000. He was, by any measure, one of the great Colombian footballers of his generation. In 2007, he was arrested in Brazil on charges related to involvement in drug trafficking. The arrest of one of Colombia's most beloved footballers sent a shock through the country. He was released. He returned to Colombia. He lived quietly. On April 11, 2022, Rincon was driving in Cali when his car collided with a bus. He was 55 years old. He suffered severe head injuries. He was taken to hospital. For several days, his family and the football world held its breath. Freddy Rincon died on April 13, 2022. He was 55 years old. The midfielder who had played in 3 World Cups, who had scored one of the great goals in Colombian football history, a last-minute equalizer against West Germany in 1990, died in a hospital in Cali from injuries sustained in a car accident. Hernan Gaviria, another member of the 1994 squad, had already been gone for 20 years by then. In 2002, during a training session for Deportivo Cali, Gaviria was struck by lightning. He was 32 years old. The bolt killed him on the training pitch. Anthony de Avila, one of the forwards from the 1994 squad, was arrested and imprisoned in Italy on narcotics charges in the years after his playing career ended. Alberto Usuriaga, the man who had scored the goal that sealed Colombia's qualification for the 1990 World Cup, was shot 7 times and killed in a drive-by attack in Cali in 2004. The 1994 Colombian squad has lost more of its members to violence, accident, and tragedy than almost any other World Cup squad in history. Of the players who were on that field in Pasadena in the summer of 1994, the survivors have followed paths that reflect the full spectrum of Colombian life. Carlos Valderrama, El Pibe, retired from professional football in 2004 after a career that spanned 4 decades and included time at Montpellier, Real Valladolid, Tampa Bay Mutiny, Miami Fusion, Colorado Rapids, and several other clubs. He played in 3 World Cups. He is the most recognizable Colombian footballer in history. His hair alone made him unmistakable in any country in the world. He returned to Barranquilla, the Caribbean city where he was born, and where he remains a figure of civic pride. He appears at football events, gives interviews, and lives with the particular dignity of a man who represented his country at the highest level, and did so with beauty. He is in his early 60s. He is still here. In Barranquilla, there is a statue of him. It was inevitable. Faustino Asprilla, the striker whose unpredictability had made him one of the most feared forwards in European football at Parma and briefly at Newcastle United, retired from professional football in 2002. His post-playing life has been characteristically unpredictable. He has operated businesses in Colombia, appeared on television, and maintained the flamboyant public persona that defined him as a player. He lives in Colombia and is still, to anyone who watched him in the 1990s, one of the most entertaining figures the sport ever produced. René Higuita, El Loco, the goalkeeper who invented the scorpion kick, had a post-playing career that involved, among other things, a period in a Colombian prison in 1993 on charges of acting as an intermediary in a kidnapping involving the Medellin cartel. He was released after 7 months. He continued his playing career. He retired in the mid-2000s and has been involved in coaching and football promotion in Colombia since. He appears at tribute events. He is still here. Oscar Cordoba, the goalkeeper who watched Escobar's own goal roll past him, continued playing professional football until the mid-2000s and became one of the most capped goalkeepers in Colombian history. He is still involved in Colombian football, working in development and coaching capacities. He carries the memory of that afternoon with him, the way all goalkeepers carry every goal they failed to stop, which is to say, permanently. Francisco Maturana, the coach, has never fully left Colombian football. He has continued to work in management and consultancy roles. He is in his late 70s. He is still here. The generation that survived 1994 has lived long enough to see Colombian football recover. The 2014 World Cup in Brazil produced a Colombian squad of extraordinary quality. James Rodriguez won the Golden Boot. Colombia reached the quarterfinals, and the country celebrated with the joy of a nation that had been waiting 20 years for a reason to believe again. The players of 1994 watched that tournament and felt, many of them have said, something close to redemption, not for themselves, for the country. The tournament may have ended, but their legacy still lives in football history. Colombia 1994 is remembered primarily for tragedy, for Escobar's own goal and his murder, for the darkness that surrounded those weeks. And that memory is not wrong. The tragedy was real, the loss was real, the violence was real. But Colombia 1994 was also a team of remarkable beauty. They played a style of football, fluid, creative, technically exceptional, that reflected exactly what Francisco Maturana had intended, a different image of Colombia. A country defined not by what the narcos had done to it, but by what its people could create when given the freedom to play. The 5-0 win over Argentina in Buenos Aires in 1993 remains one of the great results in South American football history. The squad that produced it was genuine, legitimate, and talented enough to have won the World Cup on a different day. Pelé was not wrong to name them as favorites. He was simply not accounting for what a World Cup tournament does to expectation, or for what a country at war with itself does to the men it sends to represent it. Andrés Escobar has not been forgotten. A statue stands outside the Atanasio Girardot Stadium in Medellin. His face appears on murals across the city. In Colombian football, his name is spoken with a reverence that time has only deepened. He was the gentleman. He played the game with dignity in a country that the rest of the world associated with its opposite. And he died for an own goal that was never, in any rational universe, worthy of the punishment it received. 32 years after that afternoon, in April 2026, one of the men allegedly responsible for ordering his murder was shot dead in Mexico. The pursuit of justice for Andrés Escobar lasted 3 decades and ended on a street in a foreign country. Football waits for nothing. But sometimes, eventually, something like justice finds its way to the right address. The players of 1994 are aging now. Valderrama in Barranquilla, Asprilla in Colombia, Higuita still somewhere unpredictable, Córdoba still in football, Maturana watching from a distance. Freddy Rincon is gone. Hernan Gaviria is gone. Alberto Usuriaga is gone. Andrés Escobar is gone. And the ones who remain carry with them the knowledge of what that summer was supposed to be, what it would have been, in a different world, under different circumstances, with a different ball trajectory, on a different afternoon in the Rose Bowl. They were supposed to show the world who Colombia really was. In the end, the world saw exactly that. It just was not the story anyone had wanted to tell. For one unforgettable and devastating summer in America, Colombia arrived with everything and left with a wound that has never entirely healed.